using electric drills. Victims' heads, genitals, and limbs are severed, stuffed into sacks, and dropped on the road. Every year since the 2009 election, an average of 1,200 people have been killed. An orgy of violence erupted in the summer of 2011. 300 people were killed just in July. The political parties of the ethnic groups lead the fight. The main conflict is between the Pashtuns, represented by the Awami National Party, the Mohajirs, led by Altaf Hussein, who has headed the Mutahida Qawmi movement, or MQM, from exile in London for the past 20 years, and the Baluch and Sindhis, who support the PPP. In between are extremists like the Taliban. The ethnic ghettos have become so entrenched and fortified that even Karachi ambulance services have to send out drivers of the same ethnicity as the victim, or they could get killed. The Taliban, with their thousands of madrasa students, could quite easily take over parts of Karachi when they feel the time is right. The MQM is constantly talking about separating urban Karachi and Hyderabad from Sindh province and creating a Singapore-like state, a move that would, however, lead to a civil war with the rural Sindhis. Karachi port is also the main gateway for supplies for US and NATO troops in Afghanistan. After 2001, almost 80% of all military goods destined for the Afghan war were sent to Karachi and then trucked up to the border crossings in northwestern Pakistan. Now, with new routes through Central Asia, the Karachi port caters to only 50% of the goods, and that proportion will diminish further by the end of 2011. The economic impact will be significant, with the loss of customs revenues, transport contracts, and jobs. Karachi is a microcosm of what is wrong with the country: the growing weakness of the state, the breakdown of the social contract, ethnic conflict, and the growing war between modernity, business liberalism, and extremism. These divisions can only get worse if the country dissolves into further lawlessness. The government pushed through one major reform in April 2010. Achieving agreement from all the political parties in parliament was a major achievement for the Pakistan People's Party leader Raza Rabbani, who led the initiative. Since the 1973 constitution was established, Pakistan's military rulers had created many anomalies. But in April 2010, Parliament passed a bill amending it, with 102 different clauses that rectified the anomalies. The bill also allowed for political devolution and greater powers to the provinces, which had been promised in the 1973 constitution but were never acted upon. This was a very important step in diffusing interethnic rivalries, but it cannot be implemented, because the provinces lack the money to set up the necessary departments of government that have devolved from the center. But the most pressing issue that will determine Pakistan's future, and especially its relationship with the United States, is the economy. The country is extremely dependent on American goodwill for its economic survival, even beyond the nearly $3 billion in annual military and economic aid that it has received since 2001. It also needs the United States to maintain its loans from primary lenders such as the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Union, and Japan. A confrontation with the United States could mean that Pakistan loses $4.8 billion annually in foreign assistance. Moreover, according to top economist Ahmed Hussein, capital would flee abroad. In its current tensions with the United States, the government insists that it will take the path of self-sufficiency, but it gives no sign of adopting the large-scale economic and tax reforms, revenue-raising measures, or defense cuts that will be needed before Pakistan can stand on its own 2 feet. So the question of where the money will come from is unanswered. Over 1/3 of the population is living below the poverty line, and the majority is deprived of basic services. The economy is tanking, with GDP growth at barely 2.6% for 2011, high inflation, a huge fiscal deficit of over 5%, and up to 16 hours daily of no electricity, all of which have helped to reduce production and increase joblessness. Since the 1980s, Pakistan's revenues have never been sufficient even to meet current expenditures. The entire development budget has been financed through foreign loans. Debt servicing and defense now take up some 60% of the budget. Borrowing from abroad or from the state bank has become the norm. Since 1988, Pakistan has sought bailouts from the IMF 11 times. Yet it has failed to complete any IMF programs, except for one in 2001. It signed on to its current $11.3 billion IMF loan program in November 2008, but it failed to honor its commitments to reform. Zardari said people could not take any more hardship, and he would face elections in 2013. The IMF program has ended, and most other investment has come to a grinding halt. By February 2012, Pakistan will have to start repaying the most recent IMF loan, and earlier ones too. A drawdown of reserves will create financial panic, accelerate capital flight, and force the country into default, unless it signs up for another IMF loan. Instead of seriously tackling fundamental problems of resource scarcity, says senior diplomat Malia Lodi, the government is embarked on doing more of the same, borrowing its way out of a dire situation. This approach also seems to be reaching a dead end. Yet many leaders, including Zardari, naively believe that the Americans will ultimately persuade the IMF to bail out Pakistan. The journalist Ayaz Amir has described him as a master of masterly inactivity, his forte presiding over a state of paralysis and construing it as cleverness. Considering the dire international economic climate, and the fact that even badly run countries carry out major reforms before they receive loans, help for Pakistan looks less likely than ever. A White House report to Congress in April 2011 said bluntly, "The deterioration of Pakistan's economy and slow progress on economic reforms poses the greatest threat to Pakistan's stability over the medium term." In the meantime, Islamic extremists have wisely made the dire condition of the economy and inflation a very effective rallying cry, targeting the government for its widespread corruption and waste, raising the issue of rich versus poor, and emphasizing the Islamic way of sharing wealth versus dependence on loans from the West. These multiple crises are arising as Pakistan's relations with the United States decay. The CIA's long-running disputes with the ISI came to a head in early 2011 with the case of Raymond Davis. A contractor working out of the U.S. consulate in Lahore, Davis, on January 27th, shot dead 2 Pakistanis who were trying to rob him, while a U.S. car ran over a third Pakistani. Davis was arrested, but the United States claimed that he had diplomatic immunity and should be freed. Pakistan declined to define his status and held him in jail. Davis, in fact, was part of a covert CIA-led task force collecting intelligence on militant groups without permission of the ISI. Islamic groups came out into the streets of Lahore every day to demand that Davis be hanged. In early 2009, Obama had ordered an intensification of the drone strikes in Fatah. Now it became apparent that he had also secretly authorized the CIA to conduct large-scale recruitment of Pakistanis to establish a clandestine intelligence operation with the help of 50 CIA officers and American contractors. Neither their identities nor their tasks were shared with the ISI. In other words, the Americans had set up a specific, secret, second intelligence agency to find Osama bin Laden. In telephone calls and visits, General Pasha and Leon Panetta, the respective heads of the 2 agencies, tried and failed to heal the rift. The ISI scaled back all intelligence cooperation with the CIA, demanding that the CIA list its 300 agents in Pakistan and cease independent operations there, both of which the CIA declined to do. Davis went on trial for murder in Lahore, but was freed on March 16th after negotiations among the CIA, the ISI, and the relatives of the deceased who accepted blood money of $2.3 million in return for pardoning Davis. This is legal under Pakistani Sharia or Islamic law. U.S. officials said the ISI picked up the tab, as the United States did not pay blood money. Davis had been in detention for 47 days, during 14 of which he was interrogated by the ISI. The CIA had halted all drone strikes while Davis was in jail, but 5 days after his release, an angry CIA fired a barrage of drone strikes in North Waziristan that killed 40 people, including some civilians. Kayani accused the Americans of conducting a strike that was carelessly and callously targeted with complete disregard to human life. U.S. officials insisted the tribesmen were all terrorists. The CIA-ISI relationship was now speeding downward. In April, the Pakistani military told 350 CIA officers and contractors to leave the country, as well as 120 U.S. Special Forces trainers with the Frontier Corps. The military demanded a halt to all drone strikes and severely restricted issuing visas to U.S. officials. The ISI aimed to strip the CIA of its clandestine operations in the country, while it whipped up further anti-Americanism in the media by leaking fears that the United States wanted to undermine Pakistan's nuclear weapons capability. The CIA was forced to remove hundreds of its personnel as their visas expired. Despite Pakistan's objections, the United States pressed ahead with drone strikes. There were 19 drone attacks in 2008, 46 in 2009, 90 in 2010, and just 40 in the first 8 months of 2011. The pall of secrecy that the CIA cast over the drone strikes fueled the worst suspicions among Pakistanis and Afghans and tended to mitigate whatever U.S. soldiers were doing on the ground to win hearts and minds. Controversy erupted over the number of civilian casualties caused by these strikes, something that can never be settled as long as the CIA does not explain its criteria for choosing targets. Who exactly the CIA is aiming to kill is unknown, and what legal U.S. or international rights it has to do so are also unknown. The fact that the military under President Musharraf, despite its denials of complicity, was deeply involved in the CIA cover-up regarding the drones makes the army unpopular and untrustworthy and infuriates the Pakistani Taliban, who target the security forces even more viciously as the truth emerges. By covering up the drone strikes, the army has created the worst of all possible worlds, an irate public and a vicious revenge-seeking Taliban. At the same time, the army demands that the Americans refrain from attacking those Pakistani Pashtuns whose militias are not attacking the Pakistan army, such as Hafiz Gul Bahadur and Maulvi Nazir. But these commanders have helped kill Americans in Afghanistan, so the United States has every incentive to continue targeting them. The CIA thinks that sharing intelligence with the ISI before drone attacks were launched often led to the victims escaping just in time. The growing lack of trust led Bush in 2008 and later Obama to authorize attacks without informing Pakistan first. The Pakistani public is fully aware of the ISI's unconvincing denials. A bombshell statement by Senator Dianne Feinstein, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, on February 12, 2009, exposed Pakistan's duplicity. "As I understand it, these drones are flown out of a Pakistani base," she said. A few days later, the Times of London published satellite images that showed U.S. Predator drones on a runway at Shamsi Air Base in Baluchistan. Not only was the Pakistani military helping with intelligence, but U.S. drones were being flown out of Pakistan to attack targets in Pakistan. There was also CIA deceit. Pakistanis were incensed after John O. Brennan, the White House advisor on terrorism, had the audacity to claim that for a year, there hasn't been a single collateral death due to drones. According to news reports, the CIA believes that drones have killed 600 militants, but not a single civilian, a claim that is patently unbelievable to any Afghan or Pakistani. The Pakistani military's growing belligerence toward the United States is matched by a collapse of U.S. confidence in Pakistan. In an April 2011 report to Congress, the White House said that Pakistan had made no effort to support Obama's troop surge and that the army had failed to defeat the Pakistani Taliban. The army had tried 3 times to eliminate militants from the Mohmand tribal agency in Fatah, which was, said the report, a clear indicator of the inability of the Pakistani military and government to render cleared areas resistant to insurgency return. It concluded that there remains no clear path toward defeating the insurgency in Pakistan, despite the unprecedented and sustained deployment of over 147,000 troops. Pakistan rejected the report, saying that U.S. failures in Afghanistan were to blame in Fatah's fighting its own tribesmen, the Pakistani Taliban. But the truth is that the Pakistan army was unwilling to deploy adequate numbers of troops and air power in Fatah and did not want to go up against groups whom it considered friendly, including the Haqqanis. With these double standards, Pakistan would likely never replicate its successful operation in Swat. The plight of Fatah, after 4 years of war, was described by Abu Bakr Siddiq, the region's most renowned journalist. More than 1 million Fatah residents remain displaced by conflict. Tens of thousands of Pakistani soldiers continue to battle scores of militants. Thousands have died in the course of a 7-year insurgency in the region, with traditional tribal leaders either assassinated or chased from their home areas. Fatah's status as Pakistan's backwater persists, with health, education, and other human development indicators among the lowest in Asia. And its strategic location and role as an extremist sanctuary promise to keep it embroiled in insurgency. The promise of political reform in Fatah had been held out to its people since 2001, but nothing had been achieved by successive governments. Fatah desperately needed to become a part of the Pakistani state by a grant of provincial status or by joining KP province. Its British-based laws needed to be brought into line with Pakistani law, and the services given to the people of Pakistan, such as education and health care, needed to be made available to the Fatah tribesmen. Finally, in August 2011, President Zardari amended some of the draconian British-era laws in Fatah. Collective punishment for individual crimes committed by tribesmen was withdrawn, bail could be issued after arrests were made, and, for the first time, Pakistani political parties that had been denied access to Fatah under British laws were allowed to operate there. Overall, the contradictions of Pakistan's policies are still difficult to understand. Pakistan has suffered far higher casualties than U.S.-led coalition forces. According to government figures, between 2001 and August 2011, a total of 36,705 Pakistanis were killed in the war on terror, including 3,840 security personnel and 11,185 civilians. The remainder, or 21,680, were counted as insurgents, although such a figure is deemed too high. The soldiers wounded totaled 8,617. By contrast, the U.S.-led coalition suffered a total of 2,583 soldiers killed until July 2011, which included 1,626 Americans killed. Moreover, at least 200 officers had been killed, 1 officer for every 16 soldiers killed, an unquestionably high rate of loss. This was partly due to the traditions of bravery in the Pakistan Army, where officers were taught to lead from the front, but it was also due to the lack of training in counterinsurgency. Yet this enormous loss of life is not reflected in military gains on the ground. As long as its selective approach to extremist groups continues, the Pakistan Army's high command is throwing its soldiers into a meat grinder, with no strategy or end in sight. What are these soldiers dying for? To eliminate some groups but not others? Or to satisfy American demands and thereby keep U.S. funds rolling into Pakistan? Or to combat only the most lethal threats to the Pakistani state while ignoring others? For years, people have asked these questions, but they have never received any clear answers. Meanwhile, failures have multiplied, casualties have soared, and the country leans ever farther over the abyss of chaos. Every confrontation with the United States has become an excuse to further deviate from the truth and blame all Pakistani state failures on the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan and U.S. pressures on Pakistan. Even before the killing of bin Laden, the Raymond Davis affair had led to a severe breakdown in U.S.-Pakistan relations, and in July 2011, the United States suspended $800 million in military aid. According to Robert Blackwell, a former Republican U.S. ambassador to India, the Pakistani military is not an ally, not a partner, not a friend of the U.S. Lindsey Graham, the influential senator, Republican South Carolina, summed up the dilemma, saying of the Pakistani military, "You can't trust them, and you can't abandon them." The U.S. government admitted in a report that of the first year's $1.5 billion Kerry-Lugar-Burman civilian aid, only $179.5 million had been disbursed by December 2010. Corruption and incompetence were deemed so rife in the Pakistani bureaucracy that projects could not be implemented in time. But the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, was also slow to deliver. Of the 115 schools that USAID was supposed to build in the Swat Valley in 2009, none were completed by 2011. On April 14th, General Pasha visited CIA Chief Leon Panetta to see if anything could be salvaged from the rapidly deteriorating relationship. Childishly, the CIA launched a drone missile while Pasha was in Washington. As a result, Pasha left in a huff, and all conversation stalled. 2 days later, in retaliation, Kayani, Pasha, and Gilani visited Kabul and tried to persuade President Karzai to dump the Americans and hold peace talks with the Taliban through Pakistan. Karzai wanted access to the Taliban leadership in Pakistan. Had Pakistan really been willing to help achieve peace in Afghanistan, it would have given both sides access to each other without interference. But the ISI refused to do that. For the past year, Kayani and Pasha had infuriated Kabul by making grandiose promises that turned out to mean less than nothing, because they delivered nobody to talk to. The ISI refused to release even Mullah Baradar, the Taliban number 2 who had now spent more than a year in a Pakistani jail. On April 20th, just days before the secret operation to kill bin Laden would be launched, Admiral Mullen arrived in Islamabad for a last-ditch attempt to mend relations with Kayani. "We cannot afford to let this relationship come apart," said Mullen. "It's just too dangerous. It's too dangerous in each country, for each country. It's too dangerous for the region." But there was no give on either side. Several days after the U.S. attack on Abbottabad, the Pakistan Army crafted its response. First, Kayani took the pulse among junior officers who were furious with the Americans and furious at their seniors for not retaliating. Rather than explain the complex realities to them, Kayani took the easy way out by blaming the entire episode on the Americans for breaching Pakistan's sovereignty. But he failed to answer the obvious questions. What had bin Laden been doing in Abbottabad for 6 years, and why had the ISI not found him? Kayani's failure to deliver a true narrative, either to his officers or to the public, was compounded by his refusal to hold anyone in the Army or ISI accountable for the failure. If Pakistan's sovereignty had truly been breached, then wouldn't someone have to pay for it? Sartaj Aziz, a wise old man of Pakistani politics, advised the army that an admission of incompetence is probably less harmful than accepting complicity. And he said some senior officers should resign. In any true democracy, with civilian control over the armed forces, both Kayani and Pasha, or at the very least Pasha, should have resigned. But there were no resignations, no accountability, and nobody took responsibility. The issue of bin Laden staying in Abbottabad undetected for 6 years was no less important than the issue of Pakistan's sovereignty. Even more embarrassingly, it emerged that the CIA had hired Pakistanis, including a local doctor, to monitor bin Laden's house by conducting a ruse vaccination campaign. After the raid, the ISI arrested Dr. Shakil Afridi for cooperating with U.S. intelligence, and it refused U.S. demands to free him. On May 13th, the Pakistani Taliban took revenge for the death of bin Laden by carrying out a double suicide attack at an FC training camp in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province that killed 80 cadets and wounded 140. But the biggest humiliation for the military occurred on May 22nd, when Taliban attacked the Pakistani Navy's Mehran Air Base in Karachi. A 6-man team of suicide attackers destroyed 2 U.S.-made Orion P-3C maritime surveillance aircraft worth $75 million. The battle lasted for 16 hours. 11 sailors were killed, and 2 of the attackers even managed to escape. A number of foreign workers at the base, including Chinese and Americans, were rescued. It was another inside job. Subsequently, 8 naval personnel were arrested for providing support and weapons to the attackers. With this litany of failures, the military faced growing hostility and criticism from the Pakistani press. In May 2011, a prominent journalist, Saeed Salim Shahzad, was found tortured and murdered after having gone missing for 2 days. He left behind several emails saying that if he was killed, the ISI would be responsible. Shahzad was believed to be on the verge of making revelations that would show the extent to which al-Qaeda had penetrated the Navy. An uproar ensued in the media and civil society. As the ISI denied all accusations, his death prompted a multitude of revelations from other journalists about the activities of the media cell of the ISI, whose Director General was a Rear Admiral, in harassing and threatening journalists. Pakistan was already the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist, according to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists. Many Pakistani journalists found themselves caught in between death threats from the extremists and those from the ISI. If the state was unable to provide them with security, then they had nobody to turn to for protection. The ISI came under withering criticism, and finally a commission of inquiry headed by a judge was set up to examine the murder of Shahzad. If even some of these accusations were true, it would mean that the ISI behaved toward the press in unprecedented ways, worse even than in the darkest days of the Zia-ul-Haq dictatorship in the 1980s. When journalists were flogged in public. Inflaming the controversy, Admiral Mullen said the United States had evidence that the government was responsible for Shahzad's death. Soon more journalists were reporting harassment at the hands of the ISI Rear Admiral, who was finally removed from his post. The growing political crisis, the confrontation with the Americans, and the conflict between the military and the media had little effect on Pakistani politicians. President Zardari made no public statement for 2 months after the death of bin Laden, and Prime Minister Gilani handed over to the army the responsibility to deal with the crisis. They conveniently assumed that since it was the army that had damaged the relationship with the United States, it was the army's job to fix it. But this would have been the moment for the civilian government to assert itself and insist that, precisely because the army had messed things up so badly, it would now take greater charge of foreign policy. Now was the moment for the government to insist on major changes in the way policy was formulated. Now was the moment for it to assert greater control over the conduct of the counterinsurgency war in Pakistan, over the peace process with the Taliban, and over relations with the Americans. Instead, Zardari and Gilani retreated into a studied, stupefied silence, fearful of taking any such risks. However, there were some attempts at reconciliation, although they proved fruitless. General Pasha organized a meeting between U.S. officials and Ibrahim Haqqani, the younger brother of Jalaluddin Haqqani, in the United Arab Emirates in the middle of August. The dialogue clearly did not lead to much and certainly not to a negotiation. The Haqqanis later claimed that the Americans' only intention was to create divisions between them and the Taliban. The Haqqanis' reply came forcefully to this failed diplomatic attempt. Instead, the crisis became worse. On September 10th, the Haqqani network sent a suicide truck bomb packed full of explosives into a U.S. post in Wardak province, close to Kabul. It killed 5 Afghans and wounded 77 American soldiers, the largest single casualty toll since the war began. 3 days later, September 13th, 6 well-trained suicide gunmen, also from the Haqqani network, occupied a partially constructed high-rise building in central Kabul, and rained mortar shells, rockets, and grenades on the U.S. Embassy and on the headquarters of the International Security Assistance Force. The gunmen held out for 20 hours before being eliminated. 27 Afghans were killed, no Americans, but the humiliation of having the American embassy attacked riled up the United States. On September 22nd, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta and Admiral Mike Mullen told the Senate Armed Services Committee that the ISI had played a supporting role in the Haqqani network's 2 attacks. Their comments implied, for the first time, that Pakistan was deliberately trying to kill Americans. With ISI support, said Mullen, Haqqani operatives planned and conducted that truck bomb attack, as well as the assault on our embassy. The Haqqani network acts as a veritable arm of Pakistan's ISI. Those words were to resound for months to come. Pakistan, Mullen continued, may believe that by using these proxies they are hedging their bets or redressing what they feel is an imbalance in regional power, but in reality they have already lost that bet. By exporting violence they've eroded their internal security and their position in the region. They have undermined their international credibility and threatened their economic well-being. Mullen's comments were a devastating reminder to Pakistan about the long-term consequences of continuing to maintain proxy forces on its soil. Unless Pakistan went after the Haqqanis, he said, the United States would act unilaterally. It was the harshest, most direct statement ever made by a U.S. official, and it infuriated Islamabad, which lashed back against Mullen, who was due to retire that week. Kayani made it clear that he had no intention of going after the Haqqanis, and the army was placed on a high state of alert, expecting U.S. military action. F-16s were flying over nuclear facilities to protect them from possible American attacks. For a few days, the United States and Pakistan seemed to be on the verge of war, or at least skirmishes. It soon became clear that Mullen's blunt comments had not been cleared by the White House, and the State Department tried to row back the boat and keep Pakistan on side. White House spokesman Jay Carney refuted Mullen on September 28th, saying it was not language that I would use. Others spoke of Mullen overstating the evidence. It was yet another example showing how divided and frustrated the Obama administration was with its Afghan policy, unable to clearly define what the policy was or where it was supposed to lead. The largest split remained on reconciliation, with the military still expressing grave doubts about talks with the Taliban yielding any results. On September 21st, the crisis intensified, when Burhanuddin Rabbani, a former Afghan president, was assassinated by a messenger, allegedly from the Taliban, with a bomb in his turban. Rabbani had been head of the High Peace Council, set up to hold talks with the Taliban. His death caused an outpouring of grief and bewilderment. It halted the talks process while deepening Afghanistan's ethnic divide, as Rabbani was a leading Tajik personality. At his funeral on September 24th, Tajiks made fiery anti-Taliban and anti-Pashtun speeches. Ever since the death of bin Laden, relations between the United States and Pakistan had become steadily worse. Now they were poised precariously between war and peace. Ultimately, it was left to Hillary Clinton to try to bring back some modicum of stability to the relationship. Clinton visited Pakistan in late September and brought with her several cabinet officials in order to ensure that Pakistan got a single message from all sides of the U.S. government. She was joined by the director of the CIA, David Petraeus, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, and other officials from state and defense. Her initial message to the Pakistanis was very tough. No one should be in any way mistaken about allowing this to continue without paying a very big price, she said in Kabul before she left for Islamabad on October 22nd. She said Pakistan could either help or hinder efforts to find a resolution to the war in Afghanistan. In front of his American hosts, Karzai in Kabul had weighed in with some of the bluntest criticism of Pakistan. We believe that the Taliban, to a very, very great extent, are controlled by the establishments in Pakistan, stay in Pakistan, have their headquarters in Pakistan, launch attacks from Pakistan. In Islamabad, 4 hours of talks with the full Pakistani leadership, including Generals Kayani and Pasha, ended on a positive note, with both sides claiming they had reduced their differences. The United States appeared to drop its demand that the Pakistan Army launch an attack on the Haqqanis in North Waziristan. Instead, there were more promises by the government to speed up talks among the United States, the Haqqani faction, and the mainstream Afghan Taliban. Clinton described what U.S. policy would be in the months ahead. Talk, fight, build. The United States now finally realized that Pakistan would not give up on the Haqqanis, and that it wanted a seat at the table whenever negotiations did take place. However, many officials on the U.S. side did not trust the Pakistani military and wanted to promote the idea of containment. Yet, at the same time, the Americans intensified drone strikes against North Waziristan, coming threateningly close to bombing Miran Shah, the main city for the Haqqani network, where some 15,000 Pakistani troops were also based. Until now, Miran Shah had been off-limits for U.S. drone attacks because of the presence of Pakistani troops. Many U.S. officials and experts were to take a still more aggressive line by advocating a policy of containment. Containment, expressed best by Bruce Riedel, the former Obama advisor, would recognize that the United States and Pakistan were not allies, that their strategic interests were in conflict, and that the Pakistan Army's ambitions in Afghanistan had to be contained. Rydell wrote that the Army had concluded that NATO is doomed to give up in Afghanistan, leaving them free to act as they wish there, that the sooner America leaves, the better it will be for Pakistan. They want Americans and Europeans to believe the war is hopeless, so they encourage the Taliban to speed the withdrawal with spectacular attacks. The United States would move toward containing Pakistan and conduct a policy of focused hostility. Such a policy might force the Army to be more helpful on Afghanistan, but it would undermine Pakistan's social and political fabric, rapidly increase anti-Americanism, and give the extremists greater support. Even as Clinton urged greater dialogue with the Pakistan military, the Pentagon released its twice-yearly report on the war in Afghanistan, which clearly stated that safe havens in Pakistan remain the insurgency's greatest enabler, and that these safe havens have become more virulent as the United States draws down its troops. Every attack by the Taliban and the Haqqani network seemed to strengthen those in Washington who were opposed to any dialogue with either Pakistan or the Taliban. The Haqqanis did not let up. In another devastating suicide attack in Kabul on October 29th, when 13 Americans were killed, 5 U.S. soldiers and 8 contractors, after their bus was rammed by an explosives-packed truck, U.S. public support for the war saw a further drop. A CNN poll that week revealed that only 34% of Americans now supported the war, an all-time low, while 63% were opposed. 58% of Americans believed that the war was now similar to the Vietnam War, where the United States saw defeat. The lack of support for the war was clearly becoming a major issue for Obama's strategy to win the 2012 presidential elections. No intelligence agency in the world should collect intelligence, decide which operations should be carried out, and then carry out those operations unsupervised. It is the government's responsibility to study the intelligence gathered, make the political and operational decisions, and then instruct the intelligence agency on how to act. But in Pakistan, the ISI carries out all tasks, giving it excessive powers. First Musharraf and then Kayani have allowed it to step into every conceivable part of the country's political functioning. Musharraf even made ex-ISI chiefs his federal ministers and gave others plum ambassadorial jobs. Kayani has not taken that path, but he relies excessively and exclusively on Pasha, who has a one-dimensional mind that causes frustration in the army and among politicians. The ISI's vast intelligence-gathering role has extended into such things as influencing the media and promoting political campaigns, monitoring diplomats, politicians, and journalists, acting as a foreign ministry for the army, and, most significant, having large-scale operational responsibilities, not just intelligence gathering, related to Afghanistan and India. To win trust at home and abroad, Kayani needs to immediately reform the ISI. Tellingly, the ISI continues to allow the retired military class and a handful of extremist intellectuals to publicly advocate near-lunatic ideas. For some years now, a former army chief, General Mirza Aslam Beg, has blamed all of Pakistan's ills on the spy network in Afghanistan, which was established in 2001 under the RAW and supported by the CIA, Mossad, MI6, and BND. He locates this massive intelligence center in Sarobi, to the east of Kabul. I have visited Sarobi and, needless to say, found nothing of the sort. The network's aim, Beg says, is to train dissidents to undermine Pakistan and China. He and retired General Hamid Gul, the former head of the ISI, who puts out similar conspiracy theories, are frequent guests on TV talk shows. While the ISI encourages the media to give space to such madcap theories by former generals, critical and thoughtful journalists and intellectuals are constantly harassed, tortured, or just ostracized. Under such circumstances, it is not surprising that Pakistanis are worried about their future. Where will the ideas and hopes for Pakistan's future come from if the intellectual landscape is dominated by the likes of Beg, Gul, and the mullahs? Chapter 9. Changing the Narrative. or preparing for the worst. One of the things that gets in the way of conducting good national security policy is a reluctance to call things by their right names and state plainly what is really happening. If you keep describing difficult situations in misleading or inaccurate ways, plenty of people will draw the wrong conclusions about them and will continue to support policies that don't make a lot of sense. Stephen Walt. As I write, in the autumn of 2011, the Karzai government is in free fall. The Taliban are terrifying the